service. And you'll think of these as honorable, general, bad conduct, dishonorable. It's the type of discharge that a veteran received upon leaving the military. And with that, they're given a discharge narrative or the reason that they were discharged. So they received honorable conduct, and then it'll say, expiration of term of service is the reason that they left the military. This information is reflected on something called a DD 214. Almost all veterans have a copy of this. I rarely find a veteran that doesn't have, even homeless veterans will have their DD 214 with them. It's a sacred document, and it reflects, like we talked about, the character of service, the discharge narrative, but it also tells you other information, where they served, if they served overseas, how long they served, when they entered, when they left, and it provides other information such as their main job in the military, otherwise known as an MOS, and any training that they underwent, specialized training that they underwent. And then we have something called a C file, and this is particular or specific to the VA, and it contains all relevant information on a veteran's claim, including all their prior applications for a benefit. The VA will request their military records oftentimes, so that will be in their claims file, VA medical records, and any correspondence to and from the VA regarding a particular claim. We call that a C file. And to show you a DD 214, we have Andrews, and he'll just go over that really quickly with you.
Just an idea of what it looks like. It's basically a one-page form that has your military biography on it. It'll take a little experience looking at these to learn how to read it, but once you've seen a bunch of these, you can look at someone's DD 214 and tell really quick where they fit in. Just highlighting certain boxes there, like 12D is the one that'll say the length of service, and you'll be able to determine whether they have wartime service. We'll tell you why that's important later. And then the character of service is at the bottom. There's a type of DD 214, a member 4, that doesn't include the character of service at the bottom, because a veteran is not required to give that information to certain employers and schools and other places that may not be entitled to ask for that. So everything on your DD 214 is considered a public record, except for your social security number, date of birth, and certain other information. So there's nothing on this that will ever be secret or private or somehow not accessible to you. This is true if you're representing a veteran or any sort of veteran that's making any sort of claims about their service. All of this can be requested from the government without the veteran's permission. This isn't secret. The only thing that you can't get is that character of service portion. DD 214 is important because basically for most benefits, looking at the DD 214 will tell you whether they're eligible or not. Eligible in the broad sense, not specifically like are they disabled, but in the sense of are they a veteran that has the required amount of service and the correct period of service to be eligible for a GI Bill, to be eligible for home loan assistance, to be eligible for housing assistance. So almost all organizations that give out benefits like this will be asking for a DD 214 to see whether they reach that basic eligible requirement. Diana called it sacred. I think that's a good word. There's actually a company that will print your DD 214 as a blanket, so you have something to keep you nice, warm, and safe and away from the people that told you what to do with your life. So I think most veterans know it. They know what it looks like, but again, reading it is a little bit difficult unless you have some experience in it. It's using very technical language for everything. It's using these letters and number codes that don't mean anything to you unless you start looking them up. But it's really useful to know that if you're regularly representing veterans, because then you can glance at somebody meeting them for the first time, look at the DD 214 and what they're asking for, and often spot right away, okay, here's a problem. There's an error on it, there's a mistake, or you are broadly eligible or not eligible, and this is why.
And just to add to that, Andrew pointed out to me when I was beginning in this field that DD 214s have changed over time. So the one that we're looking at is Andrew's, and he served more recently. The older DD 214s, most of them have this bottom box where the character of service is listed. It's usually at the top. So just realize that they're not all identical. They're going to look differently depending on the era that the veteran served. We are going to move on to how veterans qualify for benefits. And essentially you have to meet two requirements. You have to meet basic eligibility, which means that the veteran meets the VA's definition of veteran. And it's important to note that this is just the VA's definition. This isn't a definition that is used across all organizations, state governments, things like that. This is particular to the VA. And then after you meet basic eligibility, you have to show that you're actually entitled to the benefit, that you qualify for the benefit that you're seeking. So we're going to start out discussing how or what the VA considers a veteran. So the VA defines a veteran as a person who has served in active military, naval, or air service, who is discharged or released therefrom under conditions other than dishonorable. So essentially there are 4 elements to this. The veteran served in active duty under one of the federal branches for a prescribed minimum amount of time, and that they were discharged or released under conditions other than dishonorable. And we're going to go through each of these elements in detail. Starting with the second element. I know that sounds weird, but it makes sense. The federal branches are the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, and Coast Guard. However, the National Guard and the reserves are considered a federal branch under limited circumstances. Those circumstances, we're going to go over the next slide, which is that you have to have served in active duty. So what does that mean? So it's just enlistment in the regular Army, Navy, Marine Corps, Air Force, or Coast Guard. Or if you're in the reserves, active duty means when you're mobilized. For the National Guard, active duty means when you're federally mobilized on Title X orders. So the point of that is National Guard is really used by the states. So only when the federal government mobilizes the National Guard are they considered to be federal, and they're considered to be in active duty. And there's a note here that for the National Guard, you are considered to be in national duty during your initial training, entry training.
So the distinction is important because when you're on active duty, you're considered basically always on duty. The military owns you 24/7, 365. So if you're driving home on authorized leave and get into a terrible car accident, the military is responsible for that. As long as you're not doing something willful misconduct or illegal, anything that happens during that period is considered on duty. That's different than the reserve, where if you get in that same car accident on your way home from drilling, that's not considered on duty. Anything that happens to you is not their problem. So that's important because a lot of the incidents and injuries that we see that occur as part of the disability claims that we'll go over in detail later are not necessarily occurring while they are doing their military job, but are occurring while they're on active duty. And that distinguishes people from the Reserve or National Guard, where that is not the military's problem. They're always considered active while they are doing their initial entry training, which will last somewhere from 4 months to a year, sometimes more. So if somebody joins the National Guard and they're training and going through basic training and something occurs, that will be considered on active duty. When Justin's not doing a presentation, when William's doing a presentation on discharge upgrades, he'll talk more about that, but there's a type of discharge they can get which will disqualify them from federal service as well, an entry-level discharge. But generally, during that training period, they're considered on active duty. So if they have a serious grievous injury that occurs while they're training, even if they're National Guard, they're considered on active service during that period. So everybody that enters the service and becomes a veteran will have gone through that training period and will have been activated at least once. There was a time many years ago when you could join the National Guard and not go through that federal training process, but that period is long since passed. So anybody that is going to be characterized as a veteran will have at least that training period as active service.
Andrew, what about the 2 weeks summer training when they're considered active duty, or is that not considered active duty?
No, that's considered, if they're considered on orders at that point. On orders means that they are told where to be, and again, the military owns them and can tell them whatever to do during that time period. So those 2 weeks, weekend drill counts as well. And there's a process basically to go to activate and deactivate, and while they're on the clock during that time period, anything that happens is considered on active duty. So it can be a 2 week period, it can be even on the weekends. They go for that weekend drill and they're sent out to go get beers for everybody after work. That's still considered active duty because it's their drilling weekend. They were told to go do it. But if they do that on the weekend with their buddies, too bad, it doesn't count. If they're on active duty, it's all good. Again, no willful misconduct, no illegal activity other than that. It's good.
Okay, the third element to be considered a veteran according to the VA is you have to serve a particular length of service. If the veteran was enlisted before September 7th, 1980, there is no minimum time requirement. However, if you're enlisted after September 7th, 1980, or if you entered that active duty status after October 16th, 1981, you have to have served at least 24 months of consecutive service. Or you have to have either a service-connected disability, which removed you from service, or you served the period of time that you were called into active duty. So, for example, if a reservist is deployed for 6 months and they serve the entire 6 months before returning stateside, they don't meet that 2-year requirement, but they serve their entire portion of active duty, so they're still considered to have met the length of service requirement. Okay, just a reminder, to qualify to be a veteran according to the VA, you have to have active duty in a federal branch for a minimum amount of time, and you have to be discharged or released under conditions other than dishonorable. I'm going to touch on this a little bit, but like Andrew said, William's going to go over it a little bit more in detail after our presentation. So, what happens is the VA looks at your application and they look for these first 3 elements. If you meet the first 3 elements, they move on to the 4th element and try to determine if your service was under conditions other than dishonorable. Okay, if you served under honorable conditions, you are eligible for VA benefits. So that doesn't mean that you get the benefit that you're seeking because you still have to qualify for that benefit, right? But that just means that you're able to receive it. And once the VA determines that you meet this served under honorable conditions, you are eligible for all benefits. Okay, you have to qualify for them, but you're still eligible to apply for all of them. The VA considers you to be eligible to qualify for them. So if you don't meet this initial determination of under honorable conditions, then what the VA does is they do something called a character of service determination, which William will go over later today. But essentially, and I just covered this, but I wanted to note that when the VA goes through this 4th step, the character of service determination, and they look through your records and they determine that you served honorably, right? Their determination is not going to change your military records. The only way to change a veteran's military records is to go through the Department of Defense. But again, when they make that determination, they will consider you to have served honorably for all other benefits that you apply for.
Circling back just one instance on that, the VA is of course separate from the Department of Defense. So the Department of Defense discharges you, they make their determination. The VA, a separate federal agency, makes their determination. They don't have to agree, and they can both disagree and be following their own laws. So only because they disagree doesn't mean one of them made a mistake. We're giving you the definition of veteran that the VA has. There's definition of veterans that can be different in the state of Texas for certain benefits, for certain eligibility, for certain things that the state can do, so that there's not a conclusive definition of veteran. This is the VA's definition, but there are other broader definitions or more narrow definitions depending on who you're asking for, and those aren't necessarily going to be consistent. Once the basic criteria of veteran has been met, then they have to show their benefit, their eligibility for the exact benefits sought. So I'm going to give a broad overview of all the benefits that exist. We're not going to go in a lot of detail on most of these. I call them the easy ones because they are generally not litigated. If you have that DD-214 that says you were honorably discharged and you present it to the agency that's giving you one of these benefits, they will usually say yes, and that's the end of it. And it doesn't usually involve litigation, lawyers, there isn't usually much challenge on this. That character of service determination, if your paperwork is correct, is cut and dry. You have an honorable discharge, you are eligible. You do not, you have to get that fixed before you become eligible. The messy ones that we are going to talk about in detail, like the service connected to disability or the VA pension, that's not always the case. That's why those involve litigation and lawyers and a lot of court work. These ones, straightforward. Big ones, the GI Bill, I'm sure everybody's heard of. It's the most commonly used benefit, but what it is now under the current GI Bill, if you serve